Hey everyone. I'm sort of trying to challenge myself to do these research diaries, and I just thought I'd turn it on and just talk about what I've been working on lately, which is actually, to be honest, about 5 different papers about waymaking because it's time to publish and there's a lot of opportunities. But I think the main issues I'm circling around right now is what what kind of terms to use. Like, should we talk about mind, the mental, the cognitive, intelligence, consciousness? Feels like in a lot of the literature, these things get confused a lot. I don't know if you would agree, but do you think there's a difference between cognition and consciousness? I would say yes, definitely there is, and that this feeling of being alive is consciousness, and you can know that you have it or not know that you have it. It seems like animals have the feeling of being alive. Anything that's alive has a feeling of being alive, but that feels very different than knowing that you have that feeling, which would be something like cognition, to become aware of your body's own patterns and know them as patterns. That to me seems like cognition, which is continuous with this feeling of being alive. But to be cognitive doesn't have to mean that it's a matter of awareness of your own patterns. It can also be creating those patterns. So, how does that scale up? You start with the feeling of being alive, just sensory, just, you're born and you cry, you feel things, you smile. My dad always says I raised my head up when I was born, but I think that's impossible, right? But in any case, little babies are born and uh, they have the feeling of being alive. We don't know that we have that feeling as babies. We don't remember it. We aren't aware of ourselves as subjects yet. That comes later. But we do have to start making way through this encounter. So our parents are talking to us and we're hearing noises. The body has processing all of this. There's light coming in. At first it's all just probably like blurry and noise, and but slowly we make sense of that and we make our way through it. We have no choice but to make our way. If we are alive, we are making a way. Doesn't mean we're finding our way necessarily or navigating, because those words imply that we have a sense of ourselves, what we know ourselves as a subject, which we don't. I think most people would agree as babies, we don't have a sense of ourselves as a subject yet. But it's through making way, it's through our body starting to understand the regularities of light and sound, recognizing the sound of our mother's voice or our father's voice, which we probably already heard in the womb. We start to associate that with certain regularities of this light, of what we're seeing of a person, another person. And the same happens with everything they're saying to us. It's slowly we make sense of these regularities. We make our way through them by aligning with them, and they become part of us and we become part of them. It's an ongoing process, a matter of aligning with certain patterns. Of course, the body comes with its own patterns. It's not that it just appears out of nowhere and starts taking on the patterns of what is around it. It has this whole history, evolutionary history, but also family history. It already comes with a lot of patterns, and it's aligning those patterns with everything that it senses as it grows. And I mean, we could talk about this in terms of my dog too, who is here under the table by the fire on a winter snowy day. When she came into the world, she did something similar, but with different parameters of capacity. Not that my capacities are more than hers, but we just have different bodies and different ways of making sense of the world, of making our way. So in any case, at least this is how I see it, that from the very beginning, we're in an encounter. Our cells are too. We could also put the scale at the cellular level, or we could think of it at many different scales. But just in general, let's say the human body, it's making way. I don't think there's any one moment when suddenly there's something like mind. What I'm thinking of as cognitive really is this process from the very beginning of the body sensing this encounter that it's in and starting to align with it, with those patterns, notice those patterns, make sense of them, learn how to move its body to walk, to talk, to do what it sees out in the world, maybe the gestures from its family, to understand what kind of patterns of response will get certain patterns of response from them. So it's this ongoing process, and that's how we learn language, which is kind of through sound and gesture first. And then I think as we grow and as we evolve, this begins to take forms through external representations. I think the only representations are outside. So whenever I use that word, I don't mean that there's something in the brain. I really mean that through things like images that have been drawn or letters, the alphabet that we see, we can extend how and what patterns we notice and learn. So even though we can learn language through just the sound of it, once we have a written alphabet and we start to learn in school all these other external representations, that helps us notice more patterns and develop further patterns. We can read books, for example, which is another sort of making way that is also a matter of noticing and aligning to patterns. And this process continues, and as it's going, we also do start to become aware of ourselves as a subject. That probably starts very early. We hear our parents talk to us as a subject. So part of their patterning, their relationship with us is patterning a sense of self because they have named us, they see us as a self. The language is geared towards that. When we're learning words, we're learning to speak about a self. So slowly we do become aware of ourselves as a subject. Some of us can even remember moments of in our childhood where we became aware, oh, we are here. We are separate from our parents in a way, but also part of something that we don't really understand, but that we are agents or somehow able to think of ourselves and change our own patterns. And this is when I think what most people call cognition develops like this, that we become aware of ourselves as a subject. We start through external representations to attach different patterns to this ongoing habituation. For example, with language, been responding to sounds, and now we start to learn that there are certain symbols associated with those sounds, and that too becomes part of the pattern. So it easily starts to feel as if we are having these kind of external representations within us somehow. But actually, it's just that we're noticing our own patterns of behavior. We're becoming aware of these habits that we've taken on. So yeah, how is that different from consciousness? Do they really have to be completely distinct? Can we, through something like meditation, go back to that just feeling of being alive, where we are aware enough of our own patterns, which have become by this time cognitive and feel like voices or something in our heads because we've attached to them, to these languages? Can we sit with a space of feeling alive without cognition? Is that itself kind of making way? I think a lot of what I'm trying to figure out is how to really rethink this idea of cognition, not to reduce all this feeling of being alive and walking, crawling, swimming, driving, all these actions. I'm not reducing them to our traditional current understanding of cognitive. If anything, it's like the flip of that. I'm trying to say this cognition is what we think of as cognition or mind is really the tip of something that's been growing from the beginning. And we just noticed it through external representations. And we've noticed it through this kind of language and images that we notice in our patterning. But that's just the very tip of much more expansive and mysterious but understandable process of patterning, making way, and we can accept this awe and beauty of the feeling of being alive, of sensing the world as something that doesn't necessarily need to be explained, but that through understanding this process of making way as cognitive, we can start to understand how our own trajectories overlap and do not overlap with others. Maybe we can start to understand how we build certain patterns through the regularities, through what our families say to us, through the books we read, through the cities we live in and what they afford us in terms of green space and libraries and all of these interactions that are part of what becomes our cognitive parameters. Maybe this can help us to start to understand how those things build and how they're similar and how they're connected to other creatures and species and beings who are doing the same thing but with very different bodies. So it takes away this need for us to talk about cognition as if it has to be the same. It would be different for every body, literally. And something like a plant body or an animal body would, of course, make way very different than a human. And so they could be cognitive without it having to look anything like human cognition, while at the same time, we do share an ecological space. So we could start to see where, oh, we do actually develop in some ways that are very similar, and we can start to understand how we are very connected, even if our cognition is really diverse and divergent. There's a feeling of being alive. All those things know what it's like to feel alive. That's I think the difference between consciousness and cognition. That there are certain kinds of cognition that can develop such that you become conscious of your own feeling of being alive. You become consciousness that is conscious of itself. Consciousness and cognition are not the same thing, but they also can't be separated. There's the feeling of being alive, which I think is consciousness, and then there's consciousness of that feeling of being alive, which is, I think, what most people mean in the literature when they say consciousness, but it's not the same thing because there's a certain kind of cognitive development that happens that I was talking about before that allows a being to become aware of its own sense of being alive. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a sense of being alive. So any life, if it has a sensory capacity, it would have a feeling of being alive. It just wouldn't know that it has that feeling. But of course, there could be ways in which it knows that according to its body and its particular context that just don't compare to human ways. So that would be something to think about too, like a cell. There's a lot of literature now about cells, and that, of course, they at least must have some notion of where their boundaries are. But you can't compare it to a human notion of what boundaries are because it only makes sense for that body, that cell body, and its own parameters. In a way, our awareness of the cells are their awareness of themselves. We are aware of them in the same way that we're also aware of something like a plant or an animal. And there's a responsibility in that, I think, if you start to understand life as cognitive at all these different levels and scales, because it starts to mean that humans are becoming aware of not only their own bodies as subjects, but of life itself as a kind of subject. So we, as life, are becoming aware of life. So when we look at a certain tree or a plant, or our dog, or our city even, this is some kind of scaling of this cognitive process and also of the capacity of consciousness, just in terms of a responsibility and something that we can't pretend we don't have. So yeah, maybe we can begin to think ecologically in terms of our own mind, becoming aware of our own body, our human body, but also of bodies that we are part of in a larger way. What would that mean? How can we talk about it in a way that's scientific, but doesn't pretend like there isn't something incredibly mysterious and amazing just about the capacity to sense the feeling of being alive, much less coming to know that you have that feeling. So that's just what's on my mind tonight. I've already talked a lot. I don't even know what I've been saying, but this is what I said I would do, is just have some research diaries as I'm writing. So I'm going to post all the papers and would really, really like to hear what you think about the actual philosophy and science instead of just my personal babbling on. But at least this helps me to see what's important to me, what comes out, because it's quite dense writing these papers and thinking about science and philosophy, and sometimes it's good to just talk about it in a bigger way. Anyway, thanks for listening, and let me know if this sparks any ideas for you or you have some recommendations, and I hope you're doing great wherever you are.